The reason that I'm making these videos is because we're not being told the truth. Whether we're being outright lied to, or it's half truth, whole lie, or some people are telling their truths, it's for you to decide. What I want to talk about today is the Great Barrington Declaration, and I've got an acorn from Great Barrington in Massachusetts, where I went last week as a kind of a pilgrimage. As a lead-in to the Great Barrington Declaration and the idea of solutions. So when you're saying let's not do something, and perhaps I'm saying let's not vaccinate the planet, then you have to offer some other kind of solution to a problem. What exactly the problem we're facing with COVID is up for debate as well, to what extent, and that's what the Great Barrington Declaration addresses. So yeah, we're coming to that. But two people who are major figures, Boris Johnson in the UK and Anthony Fauci in the US, have a look at what they say in these clips. And, well, they're not telling the truth.
And so now is the time to take action because there is no alternative. And from Thursday until the start of December...
Did you get it? It's that bit where he says there is no alternative. I mean, it's just not true. One of my heroines of this whole mess, Professor Gupta, the epidemiologist from Oxford. Wow, what a time she's had. She's one of the main authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, and here is Andrew Neil on Spectator TV asking her, after she talked to Boris Johnson, which was before that lockdown announcement.
What did he say?
Nothing. But then he has responded since then.
No, clearly he didn't listen to you, did he?
He has since then responded in terms that suggest he doesn't agree with what we propose as a strategy, which is that we allow the virus to reach that endemic equilibrium, but meanwhile, try and hasten that moment where it becomes the same as flu, which may have already happened, we don't know. But to try and get there, the best thing to do is to allow it to circulate and protect the vulnerable people. And then once it reaches that endemic equilibrium, life can return to normal.
So-called Great Barrington Declaration, which talks about herd immunity. I want to show everybody part of the declaration. It says that it talks against lockdowns and then goes on to say the most compassionate approach that balances the risks and benefits of reaching herd immunity is to allow those who are at minimal risk of death to live their lives normally, to build up immunity to the virus through natural infection while better protecting those who are at highest risk. We call this focused protection.
If you just let things rip and let the infection go, no masks, crowd, it doesn't make any difference. That, quite frankly, George, is ridiculous. So this idea that we have the power to protect the vulnerable is total nonsense because history has shown that that's not the case. And if you talk to anybody who has any experience in epidemiology and infectious diseases, they will tell you that that is risky and you'll wind up with many more infections of vulnerable people, which will lead to hospitalizations and deaths.
Everybody can get infected. The risk of mortality is very, very different between the oldest and the youngest, and there's more than 1,000-fold difference in the risk. And that is, in a sense, a weakness of the pandemic. And if you have an enemy, which this pandemic is, we have to utilize that weakness to minimize the death and to minimize the collateral damage to our society.
Are you advocating a herd immunity strategy?
So herd immunity is not a strategy. Herd immunity is a fact about most infectious diseases, the course that they spread through the population. Even if we were to have an effective vaccine, we would be relying on herd immunity as the endpoint of it. So it's less of a strategy than a recognition of a biological fact. our aim is not to say we should just do nothing. In fact, that's, I think, the misconception that people have when they hear the words herd immunity strategy. Our strategy involves protecting the vulnerable. Now, how do we know about that? We've learned a lot about this disease in the 8 months that we've had to live with it.
You cannot look only at one disease. You have to look at public health very broadly. And the strategy we have used for COVID-19 has not been good for COVID-19, but it's also generated enormous collateral damage on other public health. So we think it's important to present an alternative way to approach COVID-19. And this is nothing revolutionary.
So what's Fauci doing? He can't have missed the fact that Professor Gupta is a professor of epidemiology from Oxford, Professor Kulldorff is a professor of medicine from Harvard, and Professor Bhattacharya is a professor of medicine from Stanford. Those are the three main authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which is basically saying you don't need lockdowns, you can let this virus spread through the population who aren't vulnerable to serious sickness. They will build up herd immunity quicker. You, meanwhile, focus protection on the people who need it. You can do that voluntarily. You can offer protection if people want it. And the amount of money that is being spent, I mean, at this rate, you could build every vulnerable grandmother in a household her own house in the garden, or you could buy people houses and go, well, you live in that bit and you live in that bit. I mean, billions. Well, I think I saw one estimate that in the US it's costing about 16 trillion.
The policy we currently have, which is to slow the spread of the disease, it extends the period when the grandmother and the granddaughter need to not be in contact with one another. That's already true. A focused protection plan that shortens that period, that separation, that required separation, is more humane than the current strategy of essentially an extended lockdown, in effect, for a very long, indefinite period of time. The issue is, what should the granddaughter do with her time? Does she go to school? Does she engage in normal activities? Or does she sit at home with the psychological harm that we've seen already in children and young adults and others coming from this extended isolation?
There's so many negative impacts that we know of to do with lockdown. So these three very qualified in their field professionals came up with this suggestion, and the Great Barrington Declaration has also been signed by, I think, thousands.
This reduces the amount of time that sort of isolation and separation needs to happen, and it brings us to a state where we can actually resume normal life while the vulnerable can then start resuming activities, because we've reached a state where they no longer face a threat from the young population.
If this only gets people to sit up and look around and say, oh my God, 130 million people are going to starve to death as a result of this. Just that one thought I'd like people to keep in their heads. I think it's very dangerous to talk about lockdown without recognizing the enormous costs that it has on other vulnerable sectors in the population. So I know there's a sort of libertarian argument for the release of lockdown, and I think it's unfortunate that those of us who feel we should think differently about lockdown have had our voices added to that libertarian harangue. But the truth is that lockdown is a luxury, and it's a luxury that the middle classes are enjoying and higher income countries are enjoying at the expense of the poor, the vulnerable, and the less developed countries. And I think it's a very serious crisis. And to think of it simply in terms of is this epidemic going to be over or not is really unconscionable.
The two things that I slightly question about the Great Barrington Declaration is why they suggest PCR testing. If you do at all, you have to say with a cycle threshold lower than 30, but I could make a whole nother video, in fact I think I should, about the PCR testing, and more emphasis I think needs to be given to the vast amounts of money that are currently being spent on lockdown. So anyone who thinks you couldn't focus protection by pretty much offering people, we can bring your shopping to you, we could build you a house at this rate. Meanwhile, I picked up my acorn from a beautiful oak tree that's in the grounds of the American Institute of Economic Research, which is where the Great Barrington Declaration was signed. So hopefully, from small acorns of all of our good intent, we can sort this out. But there's going to have to be some resistance. The way an acorn pushes up through the earth.